All right, let's go ahead and get started as people continue to log on. Thank you all so much for joining us for Racing the PR Classroom, supporting AAPI students and faculty, presented by the Institute for Public Relations and the PRSA Educators Academy. My name is Dean Mundy. I'm the PR Area Director at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. And today we'd like to welcome our host, Bill Amata, Chairman and Chief Connectivity Officer at IW Group, Dr. Lan Ni, Professor at the University of Houston, and Dr. Zhuwen Meng, Associate Professor at the University of Georgia. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Before we begin, though, I just want to remind you of a few housekeeping rules. This is a Q&A type forum, so to ask a question, you can type it in the chat or virtually raise your hand with the function at the bottom of the screen of the Zoomy thing. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, please type the message to the host and we will read your question aloud. Only the moderators are able to see your question, so you'll remain anonymous. If you're tweeting about the discussion, please use the hashtag RPRC. This discussion is being recorded and will be available for playback on the IPR website later today. And it's free and open to the public, so please feel free to share with your networks. We'll send out an email with the link. Lastly, please remain respectful to our host and others on the call by keeping yourself muted unless you intend to speak or ask a question. With me today and moderating our discussion is Dr. Tina Corkindale, the President and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Tina.
Thank you, Dr. Mundy. I appreciate it. And please, this is an interactive discussion, so don't hesitate to participate and please ask questions and you can unmute and start talking. So please make this as interactive as possible. So first, I wanted to thank everyone for attending and thank our speakers. I know that for our speakers, we asked them to talk about topics that they're dealing with in the classroom, but are also taking a personal, emotional toll. Yesterday, I don't know if everyone saw, but the Senate voted to advance legislation that would strengthen federal efforts to address crimes directed at Asian Americans. And we've all seen the mass shooting that happened in Atlanta, as well as just an increase, I think it increased year over year with Asian hate crimes and hate rhetoric against Asian Americans. So the first thing I would like to do is ask our panelists how they are doing themselves, to let us know how they're doing and what sort of impact this has had on them personally. So I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Does anyone want to jump in? And if you're not comfortable sharing, you don't have to either. Just wanted to check in with you all. So.
I guess I can go ahead and get started. I'm doing well in general, and my family too. I do have my parents-in-law staying with us due to the pandemic. So one very direct consequence of everything that's been happening is that I'm telling them to be extra careful when they go out and take a walk, like around the neighborhood, because in the past, I wouldn't even worry about anything like that. With them, right? But nowadays, I feel like I have to remind them to be mindful of their surroundings. I think that's one of the most, immediate consequence to me and my family.
Yeah, Tina, I have to say, I spoke to the University of Florida recently, and I told the students and faculty that I actually cried 3 times this year and last year because it was so painful to see what was happening to the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities around the country. But it was also there were moments of time when I was frustrated, I was worried, I was insecure about what was going on. And then it turned a little bit into anger. And I decided that those emotions were a waste of energy and that I should move that energy to something more constructive and positive, doing something about what was going on around the country.
Exactly the same feeling, just like Lan and Bill mentioned, especially with the most recent shooting and crime happening in Atlanta. Being at the University of Georgia means Atlanta is just 1 hour away driving from where I am. So that feeling is very intense. And that fear, for myself as a woman, and also with the students around me, you do feel, unsafe and concerned, feared about, that sort of continued violence and attack across the country happening. or increasing. So yeah, and then when you calm down, you'll think about we need to do something. That anger cannot solve the problem itself. We need to reach out for support. We need to unite together, and we need to do something to stop the hate crime and to push for a more diverse community.
Thank you all for sharing that. I think it's, and we've seen it throughout, with the protests from last summer and some of our other race in the PR classroom discussions, that, it affects a lot of our presenters personally and they experience it. And this gives us insight also into, what I'm sure you're feeling this way and your students as well. So this panel is about how to support students and AAPI students and faculty. So why don't you, and I should say before I start, Bill he is the founder of the national, it was millennial community, and now it's expanded into Gen Z. He also serves on multiple boards of universities. That's how I was actually introduced to him, as we were on the Florida Council together. And he is also very well connected to students. If I think about practitioners in the profession who really connect to students, I would say Bill is up there. So this is also a great plug for Bill and all the great work he does for students. So what I would like to hear is what can we do to be supportive of our students first off?
Are you asking me?
Sure, Bill, you can kick it off. That's great.
Sure, and thank you, Tina. I think one of the first things that I think a lot of organizations are doing is to have these listening sessions, to allow people to have a safe space to have conversations about what they're feeling, and that's very important. I also think it's important for universities and student organizations to create this safe space and invite Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders into conversations and allow them to tell their stories. And this is a message that I have for the Asian American community as well, is lean in and tell your stories. Tell everyone that you are part of the fabric of America, what your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, your struggles are. Because when people hear your stories, that eliminates these myths that are held about Asian Americans, that we are model minorities without any problems and that we're perpetual foreigners. And frankly, we are neither. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if our friends and our allies and the professors allow us to tell our stories and provide that space for us.
Yeah, that is so true. As faculty members, I really think, especially being also that minority, by standing there, you are already a role model to demonstrate your appreciation and your understanding and your commitment to take, those demonstrable actions to support AAPI students in our classrooms and also beyond the classrooms. And I must say, over the years of teaching and instruction, that I do not see that many AAPI students sitting in my classroom. And that means a lot. That means, it is even more important for faculty member to support those minority and also underrepresented students in the classroom, especially when the size is already relatively small. Just like Bill mentioned, we Asian Americans have lived under that model minority myth or the stereotype for decades. It is very easy for many people to just use simple words to describe Asian Americans as smart, hardworking, wealthy, submissive, etc., without even reflecting back on the rich history, the culture, and achievement the community has contributed to our country. It is our country, not the country. So Bill also mentioned this, the portrait for the Asian American has always been that shining example with solid education, strong family structure, and those relatively higher degree of socioeconomic success, but on the same end, inevitably being treated as a foreigner, because the emphasis of this kind of discrimination is around the word of Asian, but not on Americans. So it is very important to pay attention and take care, put emphasis, show empathy to the AAPI students that is sitting in your classroom and working with you, that You listen to their story. By being the role model, by being the supporter, allow them to share their experience, to pass the knowledge and awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. And in addition to allowing them the space to share and really talk about the sufferings and the negative, I guess, encounters with maybe with some members of the society, I would also encourage students to really think more deeply about their identity. I have done research relating to the Asian immigrant professionals' identity development, as well as how the Asian American community organizations can better really reach out to the diverse communities within the Asian American label, right? So when we are instructing the students to, I guess, work on projects or prepare for some PR campaigns, I always encourage them to really listen to your heart and see what really motivates you. What are some of the topics that you feel most passionate about that's related to your identity, and that's some of the efforts that I've been making in my teaching, in my research, and in my I guess mentoring.
Dr. Nee, I know you're doing a student campaign, and you also have a game you're working on. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
So first of all, because originally I was really planning to share with everyone the website and the game, but because of the winter storm that happened to Houston a month ago, well, 2 months ago, we were a little behind schedule. So I will just go ahead and briefly describe that, and then I will send Nikki the link after the session once we fully launch the campaign. So basically, our goal is really to help each other listen and observe the world from the other person's perspective. So the campaign's title, the campaign's name is Standpoint. One step can change your perspective. Because based on some primary research and secondary research and literature research on intercultural and intergroup tensions, we have noted that a lot of times people do not, I guess, actively support anti-racism efforts, not because they don't care, but because they don't really have the lived experiences of people that are different from them. So because of their narrow exposure to life, right? Some people refuse to believe that things like discrimination happens because it's just like the pandemic. Some people will say, oh, nobody around me has been affected, so it must be a hoax or something, right? So we are trying to really encourage more societal members to look at things from the other person's perspective. So we created this theory-based intervention program where we collaborated with the computer science department to develop a kind of a novel game. It's not very sophisticated because of the constraints in time, but the goal is really to create the different scenarios where people can experience the life, the day-to-day life for another person that's different from you, and really embed yourself in how they are feeling, how they are reacting, how they are actually, I guess, perceived by others when they take different actions. So our hope is really to reduce the othering in the society and try to really empower the community cohesiveness and connectedness. And hopefully that will help really shift the general mentality and help really to reduce the race-motivated hate crimes and hate speeches.
Is this going to be publicly available?
Yes, we are. The website is almost ready to be launched. It's that they are still working on some like technical stuff, and I will definitely share with Nikki so that you can share on your website if needed.
And how are you building this in the classroom? Like what sort of lesson plan do you have around it of how people like on this call could use it and build it as part of what they do?
Yeah, so this is a graduate seminar that I've developed called Understanding Publics. So I have directed similar student campaigns to actually to enter the competition. that's sponsored by DHS when they were trying to really address the targeted violence and terrorism. So this time we are also going to enter this competition, enter the campaign to the competition and see how that's received by the judges. So when we go over the different readings on like culture, identity, tensions, conflict resolution, and perspective taking, I try to ask students to build all these theoretical frameworks into a campaign. And we actually did the primary research. We conducted interviews and surveys, and we are building some of the elements that we have found through the research into the game components.
Oh, that's fantastic and so interesting. If anyone has any questions, feel free to please jump in. If you want to share anything, feel free to jump in as well. Joanne, what about you at University of Georgia? What are sort of you're seeing, or what is maybe the university or department doing to help support students? Okay,
so yeah, just like Professor Ni shared, I want to address that sort of the model minority misperception or stereotype really provide that opportunity to allow, or I should say tolerate, many to avoid taking on responsibility for addressing racism or discrimination against not just the AAPI community and also other racial minority groups as well. And based on my experience, that I would say there's lots of resources that we can and we should share, not just to our AAPI students, but actually should be shared with the majority, white students, other ethnic groups, to increase awareness, to educate, because we cannot do this by ourselves alone. It's more about to educate them, to make them aware about this issue. And after this webinar, I would like to ask Nikki to post some resources on the website so people can share, educators, professionals, or whoever should take the responsibility to share the resources about, the educational video you can share with your students, which is a 23 minutes video produced and developed by the California Faculty Association, to educate about, that awareness and what do you do combat the racism against AAPI community. And I also want to say the mutual support is very important. So it's not just one way. We are there to support students, but we also need the support from the students. I'm speaking on this because, we are also Asian Americans and a woman. We are also within that vulnerable group, that have been attacked or criticized over the years under the negative influence of pandemic. So, and the support is so important to be from multiple perspectives, from students, from the senior administration in my department, in my college, and also university-wise, to really demonstrate that we should do this together to combat racism against AAPI under the influence of the pandemic.
I wanted to just add something, if I could, something that Bill said, and of course that Dren said. At Grady, we just had a workshop from Porter Novelli about diversity and inclusion and that sort of thing. And one of the things that struck me, and it goes right back to what Bill said about the importance of these kinds of discussions, was this was faculty centered primarily, but there were a couple of faculty members and graduate students who said that one of them was Asian, one of them was Black, and they said that they felt very othered in our community, not the university community, but in the town more generally. And in some respects, I think that model minority thing that we have leads some of us as professors to just forget that they have those same, that they have concerns. And, I was almost heartbroken to hear one of my favorite colleagues say that she felt like Athens was a very weird community because she felt so out of place here. And So I think these kinds of things really help in small groups. I mean, I like this kind of group as well, but I think in small groups, it maybe 10 or so, it works really well, and you can get to people's real, people will really open up that way.
I totally agree with that, by the way. The smaller groups sometimes have bigger impact, and each of those people in those groups know 10, 20, 30 people in their communities that can share. But I also think that we need all of our allies, including our Black and Hispanic allies, to stop using terms like BIPOC. BIPOC excludes us. And we're not saying that the Black community and the Hispanic community and the Native American communities have not suffered. They have, and often longer in our country than us. But when you use terms like BIPOC, you put us in the other category. So we've actually been asking our Black, white, and Latinx colleagues to include Asian American and Pacific Islander in their conversations, because model minority myth makes us invisible. But I also want to just put this out there, and this might be controversial, but I'm trying to get the Asian American community to not say white privilege and white, the other one, I forgot now, because white supremacy. And part of the reason is that we don't want to push people away. And Tina was mentioning the National Millennial and Gen Z community that I co-founded several years ago. It includes a number of universities in the middle of the country. And I will tell you, white faculty members and white students have pulled me aside and said, Bill, yes, we're white. We're less likely to be shot by the police. But my parents make $15,000 a year. They don't even own a computer. Definitely I can get things that other people can't get, but I do not feel privileged. And saying white privilege pushes me away and doesn't include me as being part of the solution. So I'm trying to get people to stop scapegoating other people. And I know that white Americans are in the majority and the institutions are predominantly white, but we need white Americans to be our allies as well. So I'm trying to get away from this language that pushes people away and get people to embrace who they are and discuss those things in these small groups or in these larger groups to just be able to tell our stories, because we all have our unique stories and they're all important regardless of who you are.
Yeah, I think language is really important. Is there any, so because Bill brought it up, is there any other sort of language issues that you notice or things that people need to be careful of, and references or anything like that to make sure we're being respectful and considerate? And anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I think for the diversity and inclusion training that my college has been doing over this spring semester really mentioned a great point, which is about microaggression. And that address lots of language issues, you know, how people approach you, ask questions. Are you comfortable with those questions? What exactly, what kind of piece of information that people are trying to get by asking consciously or unconsciously of those microaggression questions? And how should we educate the students, you know, by sharing with them, be careful and be mindful. When we're looking for differences, we are looking for similarities within the AAPI community. And saying this, I just want to quickly comment on, when we talk about AAPI, or when we talk about, refer to the concept of Asia, we are talking about a huge geographic concept that include many, many countries, the national ancestry, the culture, language, religion, traditions, and also food, okay, which is, of course, one of my favorite things to talk about. But we need to look for those, be mindful and be alert to those differences, not just simply say Asian American. We have to also be careful and be mindful about those differences culturally, rooted culturally within this large community and subgroups. So language-wise, I think the education about microaggression and how to avoid asking those microaggression questions is very important in classroom.
That's a great point. We're doing in the next month, we have a study coming out on the future of work in Asia. And our first point is there isn't one Asia. It's so diverse. I mean, so it's made up of, it's very multicultural. So Dr. Shaw, you wanted to add something. So if you want to unmute yourself and feel free to speak.
Yeah, hi everyone. At Cal State Fullerton, we actually use AAPI to explicitly include the DESI community, right? Because a lot of times the AAPI acronym, people tend to focus on East Asians, and so then you've lost like the whole South Asian group. I wanted to unmute because I wanted to follow up on what Bill was saying about avoiding the term white supremacy and white privilege. I hear what you're saying, Bill, and I feel like that is part of some other conversations we've been having now for decades, right? We people in general, in terms of what is diversity. And there does always seem to be interest. In fact, I was on another call earlier this week. There does always seem to be interest in broadening the conversation about diversity and inclusion to be more inclusive, right, of things like social economic status or faith background or, even LGBTQIA identity. And the reason that I always pause is that, when we talk about diversity, there's primary diversity dimensions and secondary diversity dimensions. Long story short, secondary dimensions are the ones that you can change. Primary ones are the ones that you can't change, right? And so what I find reason to hesitate before wholesale abandoning the concepts of white privilege, which is grounded in the literature, or white supremacy, which is grounded in the history, is that if we begin to focus on the secondary dimensions of diversity, like social economic status, then we lose the focus on the primary dimensions of diversity, and that's really where our problems lie, right? I mean, when a Black man gets pulled over by a police officer and asked to get out of his car, nobody's asking that person, what's your faith? What's your social economic status? What is your sexual orientation? They're just looking at the primary indicator of diversity, which is not changeable. And so I just wanted to put that out there to say I would be really interested in further dialogue on this concept of the terms that we use and how we use them and the impact.
I agree with all the things you're saying, but one thing that has happened in our country is this need to be PC. And being PC does not allow us to have real conversations. And I think a lot of white people realize that, they have certain privileges that other people do not have. And we've seen that through the Black Lives Matters and the shootings all around the country of Black Americans, which continues to this day. But my feeling is sometimes we also have to acknowledge, first of all, that they didn't choose to be white. Second of all, the history of white Americans is also plagued with struggles. And I think we dismiss that too quickly. Irish Americans, Italian Americans, yes, sure, they're white, but they also struggled in building America. And so I think at some point we have to understand that everyone goes through some struggle. And not acknowledging that, I think, puts us in a different category that does not allow us to have real conversations. My feeling through the National Millennial community is that when people get together in the small groups, as the other professor just mentioned, things change because they may never have had an opportunity to meet a Black person or a Latinx person, even if they're in their communities. And when they have an opportunity to share their stories of struggle, to share their stories of passion and aspiration, then things change. So my feeling about talking about white supremacy, it pushes people away. And I will tell you, a lot of people tell me, I want to have this conversation, but I'm afraid of cultural misappropriation. I'm afraid that if I say something wrong, I'm going to be told that I'm wrong. I'm okay with that. but when I'm in the room, I feel like I'm excluded now. So I feel that we should create an environment where we could have these discussions, where we can discuss the things that are hurting our communities and what we can all do together to fix the problems that exist in our society. And I think a lot of times it's an East Coast and a West Coast thing. And people don't realize that there are other people in our country than people in California and New York and in Texas. So I'm just putting it out there that I want to just shift the conversation a little bit so that people feel welcome to express themselves and people feel welcome to say things. And just an example, I was in a meeting and a Caucasian gentleman says, Bill, I'm a little confused about this conversation. I really want to try to embrace Hispanic culture. And one of the ways I do that is eating Mexican food like tacos. I love tacos. And somebody literally got up and said, that's racist. How dare you say something like that? Not all Latinos eat tacos. Well, could there have been a better way to pull this gentleman in the conversation? And I was very hurt by that conversation because I thought it was a teachable moment, and we don't take time to provide those teachable moments. And I get it. There's all this stuff that goes on around the country, but I want people to just be a little bit more patient with those folks that don't have the exposure that some of us have on the West Coast or in the East Coast.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, and I'm very glad that we are having this discussion because honestly, in some of my classes, students have shared similar perceptions. Things like sometimes they are afraid of being labeled or attacked when they want to engage in some in-depth conversations about these very controversial topics and sensitive topics, right? So what, like in my experience with doing research related to Asian Americans and also other racial minorities, I've started to kind of realize the importance of sometimes like considering both the I guess the primary diversity factors like Dr. Shah was talking about, and also some of the fundamental value orientations, cross-cultural value orientations. For example, one of the projects that I'm working on with my students, one Black, I guess, liberation organization, was that they would try actively to form a partnership and find allies with people, not just within their community, right? So in that sense, even though you may be white, if you share the same value of like pursuing social justice and ending racism, you are one of us, right? So I think it's we do need to be mindful of I guess the historical context of the terms like white privilege and white supremacy, because indeed, these, especially white supremacy, is one of the, I guess, root causes of some of the targeted violences nowadays, especially domestically. But at the same time, I also have a feeling that, and I'm learning in the whole process as well. I'm learning that sometimes we need to really try to also, I guess, pay attention to those movable middle, like people who are willing to help, but they are kind of hesitant and they are afraid of some consequences. I think I'm all for like engaging in very in-depth and difficult, sometimes I guess heated discussions, instead of like letting people pretend that nothing happens and we agree with each other, because I think that kind of surface level consensus is very detrimental to the ultimate goal of pursuing social justice.
Dr. Ming, do you have anything to add? And then I can go to the questions in the chat.
Well said by all the audience who had shared. And it is very important. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, the education is not just to support the minority sitting in the classroom, but actually is more for the majority to raise their awareness. And I know we are a bunch of college professors sitting here discuss this issue and talking about, that elite group who are getting the higher education, but we also, I wish I could have that, power or the action to kind of start the conversation with the K-12 education to integrate the discussion from early on. Don't wait until they get into college, then start talking to them about there's a racial difference and there's a microaggression question that's inappropriate to ask. And that's the thing we need to do to bring on the discussion, the exposure, the understanding, and support early on to eventually drive the change from the long-term perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I think the language conversation is really important. And I just love this conversation because, as academics, we are very concerned with the language and nuances of language, and it does have a tremendous impact in how we get our point across and understand communities. So Professor Brown, you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thanks, Tina. I appreciate it. And then this is a phenomenal conversation, long overdue. I'm glad we're doing it. I'm seeing similar things that happened last year around the Black Lives Matter movement, in that there are things that have been accelerated in terms of what we're doing on campus and so forth. And now that we're all planning to, at least we hope, planning to resume getting back on campus here at Temple, we just started starting an affinity group for our AAPI colleagues, as well as an AJA Temple chapter. And I'm wondering, how do we take advantage of this moment? And what can we learn from this moment in terms of how best to give voice for something that has been neglected for so long? So I open that up to certainly the panelists. And I happen to be, fortunate enough to be an ally in helping to move some of these things forward, while taking what I've learned specifically as an African-American male who has been through similar situations going forward.
So some of the suggestions, I serve on the Anti-Racism and Discrimination Committee in our Valenti School of Communication. So we are working on initiating some tangible action items to help support AAPI community. And obviously some of the, action items were related to and very similar to the action items that we developed last year as a result of the summer protests. And so I think one very important component is education, because I would say, and I agree with you, David, that some of the sufferings and struggles of the AAPI community have been invisible for various reasons. So even a lot of people within the AAPI community themselves are not fully aware of the kind of discrimination and racial subjugation that historically have been exposed to the community members. So I think it's important for, at least in our institution, we are trying to engage in more speaker series, also publicize and promote more books, stories, popular culture, like movies that really illustrate the different experiences of the AAPI community members, just so that people can start to have some sense of the status and the experiences of people. Because even that first step, I think, is not, we have to do a lot to even reach that first step. And then we can talk about some of the additional support mechanisms, like providing professional development opportunities for AAPI students in our community.
Yeah, to add on what Professor Lan was saying is, I think for each institution, higher education institution, the component service is big. So beyond the teaching and research, we do carry, responsibility about community outreach, community service, or service learning and experiential learning, which are the very important component to add on the curriculum for today's higher education institution. And I would say to increase awareness, to educate, it starts with training session, talking points, discussion, even discussion forum like this. Doesn't need to be a formal panel, could be informal panel within groups, within the class, either virtually, or maybe in the future we can move back to the in-person discussion if people feel comfortable to speak up. And also it's critical to invite and connect with some local and even national advocacy groups within each city, within each region. There are many of them, and they know the historical, the histories and those cultural contexts, the mass media, mainstream media's portray or the coverage much more. And they also have very strong networks, resources that they can introduce to students, especially early on, and even to faculty, I would say, to let them know, to understand the safety, the well-being, the history, the struggle the AAPI community and even other racial minority groups are facing. That will really bring on that awareness from the service learning point to educate and to facilitate the discussion and conversation.
Thank you. All right, question from Professor Ford.
Thank you, Tina. Well, first a comment and then a question. I'm really impressed with this discussion, and there was a similar discussion last night with ColorCom. There was a discussion last week, as Bill said, UF. There's going to be a great discussion at the PR Museum next month. That's for the second year we're all going to look at the history of this, and I do think that this is long overdue, and I agree with Professor Brown that as with the reckoning last year, these discussions needed to happen, and sometimes the best approach is just show up and stimulate these discussions and welcome them, and not do what we do a lot of times, which is try and solve the problem on the spot, but give vent to some of these concerns and learn in more depth. There's a huge amount of blocking and tackling that needs to happen when a lot of us just want to kind of express how supportive we are or how nice we are, or encourage these discussions. Sometimes you really have to spend the time and devote the attention to it, because there's a lot underneath here. There's a lot below the surface of these very moving, cathartic discussions. And so I'm finding that I've called a lot of audibles in my courses in the past couple of class 3 semesters, between the pandemic and as Chuck Wallington calls it, the twin pandemics of COVID and race and ethnicity. And what I mean by that is I've just ended up throwing out my plan for several classes. Right after Atlanta, I had nothing related to that planned in my classes, but we got started in the class, and it was very evident that our students, and I don't just mean Asian students, I mean all of our students, were deeply troubled by this and wanted to talk about it and talk about how it felt to them. And so I tried to then bring that back for the sake of the education part to our course. But sometimes I think just showing up at these student events, back when I was with my firm, I tried to be involved with our affinity groups for various communities in our firm. And now at UF, we've got, we started by our own students. We have a student chapter of Beepers. We have a student chapter of HPRA. We have a student chapter of, well, actually, we started a chapter of the Asian Public Relations Student Association. And when they welcome me, I just show up, and I really have a sense they appreciate that, not only for the respect it shows, but because they want to know that what they're saying and expressing is heard. Having now been immersed in this generation for 4 years, by the way, the most gratifying period of my very, very lengthy career. I am deeply hopeful and deeply impressed with this generation. And they're very action oriented, and it might feel like we're talking too much about these things, but I would say the more of these that IPR and PRSA Educators Academy are doing, and more of that a lot of our organizations are doing, to just get the discussion moving along. And with each one, there are more and more specific examples. And I guess I would ask, you know, for the panelists here, what's our next step? So we're having more of these. It's very healthy. And I think we're touching on a number of things here, but what are the most important steps we need to take now to move this from talk to action? Because that's a big part of the feedback is we've talked a lot about this. Where's the action that backs that up?
I've been encouraging corporations to include Gen Zers early. The institutions that we all try to tear down are often led by boomers and older Gen Xers that you know, kind of clog the pipeline for success because, you know, boomers just think they're millennials now. And even though 10,000 are retiring every single day, a lot of the institutions that are run across America are still run by boomers and older Gen Xers. So I've been encouraging universities and corporations to include Gen Zers and younger millennials early in discussions. Don't hide things from millennials and Gen Zers. Include them in the challenges and problems that our communities and our corporations and our governmental institutions face, and allow them to be part of the solution. They already represent more than half of our population, but for some reason, a lot of companies and organizations don't think they're ready to take leadership roles. So the ones that have younger people involved early are the ones that do well. And I'm also encouraging Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, including faculty members, to lean in and join other organizations, join Black organizations, join Hispanic organizations, women's organizations, traditionally white organizations, so that we understand the issues that those communities face, but they will also get to see somebody from our community represented in their organizations so that our voice is shared there and their voices are shared with us.
Great suggestion, great actions, as Bill mentioned, from the corporate side. And from the educator's perspective, just like I mentioned earlier, we ourselves, by standing there, you are already being seen as a role model to advocate for the AAPI community as well as for other racial minority groups. And I teach ethics and leadership here at the University of Georgia. There's one thing I always do is to ask my student to write. You know, sometimes, especially when the awareness level is low or people feel uncomfortable to have this kind of very open discussion, the best way is to push them to do self-reflection. If I ask them, pick 3 typical stereotypes that you would come to your mind when we talk about the cultural differences and the cultural similarities, you will be surprised to see students' answers. Then you can also collect the answers. Then you can build in your course content to address those, you know, stereotypes or the misunderstanding, misperceptions from the diversity and inclusion perspective, to have the discussion, to have the course content built around what they are missing. And that is such a, I would say, uncomfortable way. Sometimes students will say, this assignment make me uncomfortable. Then you get it, because we have to be uncomfortable first to feel comfortable to talk about this and to advocate for actions and change. So I really think this has to be it's a challenging task. It's not going to be solved in one day or through a webinar or through one lecture. And historically, it's there. And we never raised that voice until the shooting thing happening in Atlanta. And I'm not surprised to see that happen. I know one day it's coming. It's just, it comes so late that now the discussion is on. So it's so critical to build into, you know, every single piece of action that you can to, you know, sort of like perpetuating into that mindset and to raise awareness, to make them aware this needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Dr. Ming. Dr. Nee, you do, I mean, you have a book on intercultural, you've done research looking at empowering minorities and immigrant population and organizations. What sort of, do you have any suggested assignments? I know what Dr. Ming said, it's not just one assignment, but do you have any suggested like assignments or how people on this call can have these sort of conversations and think about outside of playing your game? Is there anything that, you know, with Dr. Ming saying her 3 ways, is there anything that you can think of that you think is really successful in the classroom?
Yeah, so in my grad seminars on like intercultural public relations, I always encourage students to do something similar to what Dr. Meng has just mentioned, but in a different format. I try to, again, make things difficult for them. I ask them to specifically choose like certain conflicts between groups. And the conflicts can be related to, I guess, interests, but more importantly, I would like them to really think deeply about conflicts arising from different, I guess, value orientations, and sometimes because of the different identities. Because it's easier to resolve a conflict if you are only talking about interests or like financial kind of benefits, right? But it's much, much harder to find a way to even sit down and be willing to talk to each other if we are talking about conflicts related to values and beliefs. So that's one of the assignments that I asked them to do, to really provide some kind of scenarios relating to different intercultural group tensions. And I asked them to engage in perspective taking, really kind of listening to understand where each other is coming from, and then try to be creative and generate some sort of, I guess, maybe not necessarily solutions, but some sort of suggestions as to how we can move forward from where we are now. So I think, and that's related to their final project as well, if they choose to expand it into a final project. And I think it really pushes them to think hard.
Thank you, Dr. Nee. Dr. Mundy, you have a question.
Yes, so we've been talking a lot about the classroom itself in terms of, you know, best practices in the classroom and different assignments. One of the things that's always on the top of my mind is how do we not only prepare, but then support students as they're going into the job market. And the one example, and so I get frustrated because the one example I'm thinking about is that one of our top students, probably our top PR major 3 or 4 years ago, was originally from Beijing, and she had an amazing record, absolutely amazing record, and she could not find a job on the West Coast anywhere. And she came to me and said, you know, I think they see my name, and I think they see that I had an internship with the Edelman Beijing office, and they make assumptions. And she could not get her foot in the door. And we kept trying to like just apply and call and just talk to as many people as possible, because she was amazing. But there was that barrier of just getting into a corporation. And I think she was probably right that they looked at her name, they looked at the fact that some of her experience was in Beijing, and they made these assumptions. And so they didn't, and it infuriated me. So any advice on how we can support students who are amazing but are having that trouble with the workforce?
Well, there is a lot of documented research on resumes and names and the implicit bias around names, but that's another conversation. But I do want to recommend this is, I probably wouldn't say this openly to a lot of people, but appeal to the self-interests of the companies. And a really smart PR student will say, okay, here are my skill sets. This is what I can bring to the table, and find the companies that have won business in an area where they're trying to expand in the market. If she has that skill set because she worked in Edelman China, there are a number of companies that are trying to reach that market. And frankly, when you hear about an agency like Weber Shandwick or Golden Harris, or even one of the smaller companies that have won business overseas, that's the time when you approach those companies. And it's very easy to see who wins that business just by reading the PR trades. And so I would say, when a company wins a big piece of business, they're going to need to hire somebody that has skill sets both in the US and abroad. And that's where she should apply. And that's what I've been telling a lot of the Chinese students. in Asian students that came from abroad or live or born here and have some skills to go to those companies. Again, appealing to the self-interest of those companies because they will need those skill sets moving forward.
Yeah, I can agree with Bill and more. It's so important, and I think the confidence should come from both sides. So students, especially minority students, no matter international students or Asian American students or others, I always tell them your diversity is your strength. Sometimes, you know, they are a little bit reluctant to demonstrate their diversity as strengths. And that's something really need to be reinforced. Because you have diverse background, because you have a diverse experience, that should be treated as your, you know, assets that can help you to overcome lots of things that other people might not have the opportunity to experience. And especially by leading, you know, study abroad program that I personally experienced to take our students at the University of Georgia to Asia, to China, to Hong Kong, to other places, to learn from the top leaders in the agencies or companies. That is, you know, eye-opening experience for students here to get exposed to the cultural experience and professional learning over there, and vice versa. When they came over here to study, it's equally important for corporate and agency here in this country, in United States, to open the door to let them also bring in that cultural perspective. And I know it's hard. It's easy for us to discuss here, but I guess back to Bill's point, that support really should come from the senior leadership in the corporate, in the people sitting in the boardroom, to open mind and to open the policy to give young people opportunities.
And I just wanted to add one quick thing to this wonderful discussion about like really supporting the AAPI students. It's something related to the identity development, right? Especially for a lot of international students who had to come here, who came here to study, facing the language barrier sometimes, in addition to all these other complex barriers. I think it's important for the educators to really help them learn to search for like the real value, like who are they themselves, right? What is being, like I see a comment here about being the authentic self. Because in terms of the immigrant professionals that I have studied before, they are facing the same challenge. Who am I? Am I am I more American than, let's say, Indian? A lot of times it's a struggle. And I think it's the most, I guess, healthy and productive way to look at this is how can I integrate things that I value from my home culture and things that I value in this new culture, how I can engage in productive cultural adaptation without losing myself, and how I can really bring the synergy of different aspects and form a more kind of intercultural and more balanced self-perception of myself. So I think that's just a quick kind of addition to what has been said.
Great, thank you all so very much. Yes, we didn't even touch on bringing students in. We get a lot, I mean, we rely a lot on our international students. So how we make them when they come in, that's part of the inclusion piece as well for universities. So we're out of time, but I wanted to thank our amazing panelists, Dr. Nee, Bill Amata, and Dr. Ming for being here today. We really appreciate you sharing your insights. This was recorded. We will send this out with the notes and resources below. But this was a really fantastic discussion. I appreciate all of you sharing with us. And thanks to the PRSA Educators Academy for their partnership. And finally, next month is our last month for season 1. And then season 2 will kick off again in the fall. So stay tuned for that. But I hope you all have a wonderful day. And thanks again to our awesome panelists and all of you for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.